بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله المبعوث رحمة للعالمين. So here we wanted to get an overall perspective, zoom back out, so to speak, so that we can have some sort of framework for what it is that we're doing, that gives us a bigger picture. So mostly we've been focusing in this area here, which is the Sahw, or is dealing with that area of the salah in which there is unmindfulness to the extent that we may be deficient in performing an action, or we may increase in an action. And the same thing when it comes to speech as well. We may increase in speech or decrease in speech. So that is where we have been focused on with a little bit of detail. And we've been focusing on al-qabli and al-ba'di, which is a distinguishing point of the way that Maliki fiqh deals with this. And al-qabli means that that instance in which sujud is performed before the salam, and al-ba'di means that instance in which the sujud is performed after the salam, because the sajda for sahu, or the sajda for unmindfulness or forgetfulness, can be performed before the salam or after the salam, but there is some rules to that. It's not just a whimsical type of thing. And in the madhab of Malik, there's a combination of these two because of prophetic practice. And there is a follow-up on that type of thinking as well within the Hanbali school. As far as the Hanafi school, the sujud is before the salam, and the Shafi school, the sujud is after the salam. Right, and all of them have their own logic as to why it is that they deal with the situation the way that they do. But one of the most comprehensive in this regard, as far as the madhab are concerned, one of the most comprehensive treatments of this topic is within the school of Imam Malik. Now, overall, uh, what we have here, what we have here is a conversation on Salah, and that conversation on Salah, it is a systemic conversation or a systematic conversation. And what it entails is having an understanding that Salah, it consists of the fara'id, the obligations. It has conditions to it as well. And those are the pillars of the Salah, so to speak. That's what upholds the Salah. But as we know, that just as a house is not only a bare bone structure, you have to have other things in order to make it really functionable and livable. The same thing when you build out the salah. It's not just about that basic foundation as well. There's complementary acts. And so in the madhab of Malik, the sunnah complements the fara'id being those things which are obligatory. The conditions also are set there for um, establishing what is foundational, right? So that is what creates that basis in the salah. But the sunnah complements. And so the sunnah is broken up into sunan overall, right? And that's how we get the category of sunan al-muakkada and al-khafifa. Al-muakkadat is the plural of al-muakkada. And the muakkada is that which is normative It was practiced with consistency, frequency. It is that which is affirmed in prophetic practice. And then you have sunnatul khafifa, or you can even say fada'il as well. And those things are affirmed, but they are not of the same degree as al-mu'akkadat. And that is important because when we start talking about such the sahw, if you notice, there's these dots that are placed here in these different sections. So this is the fara'id, this one right here. This is the conditions. These two pretty much go together. So then you have the sunan, they follow up on those things which are the obligation. The fara'id is the plural of fard, which is the obligation. These dots, the green dots, represent the areas in which there is sajda sahw. The red dots, there is no sajda sahw for those things, right? And as we mentioned before, the fara'id or the obligations, if you are forgetful to the extent where you miss something that is an obligation in the salah, sajda sahw by itself is not enough to cover it. We mentioned that before. Now, the tricky part is this, that if you miss something in the salah that is an obligation, or you repeat it an act, which is an obligation, then that means that you changed the form of the salah and you didn't meet the requirements. So you would have to correct your action. So, for instance, if you missed something which is obligatory, and this is a conversation that we're trying to have it in as much clarity as possible so that your mind can conceptualize what's going on. If you miss something in the fara'id, and there's detail to that. So we're just, don't be a literalist and just stick to the words as is, but just take the general concept. There's exceptions to the rules, there's details, but first we need you to get the concept. If you miss something of the fara'id, you have to ensure that that thing is established. If it's deficient, if it's a point of deficiency means that you missed something of it, then you perform that action, and there's rules to that, and along with that, sajda sahw. If you repeated an action that is an obligation, it means that you changed the form. So the sajda sahw here would come after the salam, just as a way of correcting the salah. Now, from the ni'mah of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala is that we have this process of being able to safeguard our good deeds. It's not a matter of doing an action and you make a mistake and it's just a wrap, so to speak. And that type of thinking, we have to have it also in life itself. Because if Allah Ta'ala wanted to make us like the angels, then Allah will make us like the angels. And the angels are without sin. Right? That's the dominant understanding that we have. Shaitan was not from the malaika, it was from the jinn. And the jinn and the ins, or the human beings, are the two creatures that we know of, we've been told of, that have liberty of choice with some conditions, of course. Right. So the issue of the thinking here is that we make mistakes, right? And even the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this is a point in Aqidah, it comes up. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam forgot certain things, and then he was preserved by Allah Ta'ala and guided. It's possible. But the Prophet also alayhi salatu wasalam left the example to us of how to correct our actions, and in this case, salah. And may Allah allow us to establish it and to uphold it and to benefit from it in this world before we transition to the hereafter. But the reality here is that sajda sahu, when it comes to the obligations, is more complementary than anything else. But when it comes to the sunan, uh, it really shines in the area of sunan al muakkadat, and we covered those 8 points, and we come back to those. And anything that's missed with two or more, some scholars say three or more of the khafa'if or those or the khifa, those sunan which are classified as other than muakkadat, they're at a different degree. They're not as normative. Then the sajda sahu, it covers ground in that regard. And the mubtilat, we kept the Arabic word there, are those things which invalidate the salah. And the makruhat are those things which are disliked. So in these three areas, the mubtilat, the makruhat, the fada'il, there is no sajda sahu in this regard. And to be honest with you, even in some points in the conditions, there's no sajda sahu, and that has its own detail. But overall, the other areas, these three areas, the fara'id, the conditions, and the sunan that are muakkidat, and the sunnatul khafifa, uh, those areas are areas within which sajda sahu um, dominates. Right. So then now we shift to um, our text, the ladder, really fast, with the logic of keeping that framework in mind. So overall, this text, the idea of framework is important where we zoom out a little bit, because sometimes when we go into the details of things, we can get lost. But here, when we look at the text, the book is framed out as firstly dealing with the conditions of the salah, second, the obligations, the sunan, the fada'il, which are considered the merits, those things which are disliked or the reprehensible actions, the makruhat, the mubtilat is chapter 6, that which nullifies it. And then 7 and 8 pertain to sajda sahu. And the way that the book sets it out, it gives two distinct treatments to sajda sahu. So one chapter is devoted just to dealing with sajda sahu that is performed before the salah. And the second, dealing with sajda sahu as is performed after the salah. And then there's a closing discussion on the text itself. So that's key. So overall, we get this understanding, and I mentioned this before, but it's important to mention it again. We get this understanding that everything that is in yellow, it has to be comprehended and understood before we can get to Um, let me put it to this way. Before we can deal with what is in green. And what is in green is the knowledge of Sajda Sahu, right? And what makes Sajda Sahu a very comprehensive chapter is that it is about correcting the salah and so on and so forth. But if you don't have the basic framework in place, and that basic framework entails that you understand the various divisions of the salah, and if you don't have some of those details in mind of what that means, what are the obligations? What are the sunan? What are the fada'id? What are those acts which are makruh? What are those acts which invalidate the salah? Then Sajda Sahw doesn't make a lot of sense, although the concept may be clear, but the details of it and how it applies and so on and so forth, it will not be clear because it's just that type of knowledge that uh, it builds on everything that you learned prior to. It builds on everything that you learned prior to. So we've been covering Akhdari, and I'll send this back out. I'm not very content with the way that translations are done, and I've paused a number of times. And of course, I've given myself that license in calling this a study group and so on and so forth. It doesn't have to always operate in the way that a standard class operates, where these types of discussions are really outside of the class because the role of a teacher would be just to present the information and check the student's understanding, and that's it. So but here, we try to go into some other points and make the study a little more free so that um we're not bound by the same restrictions. We're not bound by the same restrictions. And so one of the things that comes up is that definitely, especially for the modern student, there's a necessity to organize the information in a way that is more digestible. Because there is, first of all, the translations, there's issues that come up with them. And second of all, for instance, like when you look at this text, this is from al-Akhdari, which is the most comprehensive of books, even in relation to the major books. Al-Akhdari is a smaller text, but is the most comprehensive on this subject, said the Sahw, hands down. That doesn't mean that everything in Al-Akhdari or everything in this topic is always the most relied upon, so to speak. But for the most part, it's relied upon and it's the most extensive discussion. That's why Al-Akhdari has remained a go-to in this area, right? But the thinking was a lot different than what we have today in terms of presentation and so on and so forth. So this really, it lacks chapter headings so that you can organize the knowledge in a way that is perceptible and clear, right? So you see this belongs here, that belongs there. Okay, this is the relationship between this and that type of thing, right? So we've been covering some things. Today we just kind of want to go through as much as possible what we can of points in the text. Some we have already have covered, others have yet to be covered. And we've talked about maybe what is the best way to finish off the text, given that Ramadan is coming soon. And I wanted to start the Ramadan boot camp program every year. I make the same intention, and it always ends up uh, being that something comes up as to why it can't be done. And this year, I'm somewhat determined not to allow myself to not take advantage of the opportunity to properly prepare mentally and emotionally so that I can also put myself in a better position spiritually and just do that along with others. So the first thing that comes up here is in this section, he clarifies uh, the whole concept of Sajda Sahw being two raka'at, and then there's mention that it can be done before the salam or after the salam, right? And it's not just two raka'at of sujud. I'm sorry, it's not just, I should correct that. Two prostrations is not two raka'at. Two prostrations, sajdatan. He clarifies that it's two prostrations, and they can come before the salam or after the salam. And they incorporate the tashahhud as well and a taslim or salam. So he mentioned it here, prostrating for forgetfulness in the prayer is the sunnah. Now, that has its own discussion because it's not always the case that it's the sunnah. Uh, but in general, we say that it's a sunnah, right? We say it's a sunnah in general. And this is part of the dilemma with the having to explain this self without going into detail. What I mean by that is that the text says the sajda sahu or sujud sahu fi salati sunnatun, that it's a sunnah, right? This here was said here, the traditional practice. Really, I wanted to do this. That's not correct. And that as the sunnah here is not talking about the traditional practice of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We know that the Prophet did that. The Prophet also prayed salah. Doesn't mean that it's a sunnah because the Prophet prayed salah. So there's a mixture of concepts here, right? The prophetic practice as a whole is the sunnah. But here we're talking about what is the ruling for it? What is the ruling for it? Is it an obligation or not an obligation? Versus that, what if it's a source of knowledge or if it's the prophetic practice, right? Because we call the sunnah a source of knowledge in addition to the Quran. When we go to more detail, the sunnah is a source of knowledge that communicates to us prophetic teachings as far as his sayings and his actions. Then we go a little more deeper. Certain things that the Prophet did, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, are obligatory. Other things that he did, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, are recommended, right? They're not obligatory. And so here the translator shows that there's some deficiency in really translating those ideas. Translating here means communicating those ideas clearly. The problem that comes up here, and I don't want to go too deep into it, is that there are some occasions in which sajda sahw is an obligation, right? And that comes up in the text. So just because you see it here doesn't mean that there's no other nuance. Just because you see it said here that sajda sujud al-sahwi fi salati sunnatun, that the prostration of forgetfulness is sunnah, it doesn't mean that there's no other detail. Okay. That's that's something to be aware of. That's something to be aware of. So he says that the sajdatan, it can be for a deficiency, right, that has occurred in the salah, or an excess that has occurred in the salah, right? Those concepts we already know, right? So for deficiency, and one of the, let's leave it at the sunnah al-muakkada, is before the prostration is before the salam. In excess, meaning that you added to the prayer, then it's after the salam. And of course, this point here that is made, even though this is from the translator, sorry, this is from the translator, it has its validity. We're talking about unintentional actions, unintentional speech as well. Right? Two prostrations are made for what has been unintentionally omitted or forgotten in the prayer. That's before the salam, right? And that's after the completion of the tashahhud. You add the prostration. After you do the prostration, you do another tashahhud and then you salam out. In the case of an increase in the salah, right, as for what has been added to the prayer unintentionally, you make two prostrations along with the tashahhud and the salam, but all of that is done after you salamed out of the prayer because it's not part of the prayer. The first one, this one here, the tashahhud before the salam, is an obligation. That's why we said that here, to say that it's a sunnah, it lacks a little bit of detail, right? It lacks a little bit of detail. And that becomes a little more clear in the text itself when you look at some of the examples that are given, right? That's why the conceptualization of the salah, having a concept in your mind of the salah, kind of like a blueprint where each section of the salah is understood as a whole and in parts, meaning there's this concept of obligation. Okay, what are the obligations, or what does obligation mean, and what are the obligations? That's the parts to it. There's this concept that's called sunnan. Okay, I understand what sunnan means in the salah. We're talking about in the salah. I understand what actions are classified and judged to be sunnah. I understand what actions are classified and judged to be an obligation. I understand those actions in detail. The same thing with the sunnah. And the fada'il, what differentiates the sunnah from the fada'il, or those acts that are considered to be meritorious. Meritorious meaning that they increase you in reward and they aid you in perfecting the salah. So having that concept in mind, along with knowing what invalidates the salah, what's disliked in the salah, all of that has to be in your head first, right? And I keep mentioning that because that's important. That's important. That's the difference between, like, in order to get that knowledge requires some work. It requires some review. It requires some effort. It's not just a matter of listening to a talk and then just being quizzed on it and leaving. No, it requires some real thought. It requires some, I don't want to say memorization, but familiarity. Memorization is good as well, but familiarity. So now this section here, it introduces to us a new concept. And the concept that it introduces to us is a detailed point with regard to the prostration that's made before the salam. Okay. This section here introduces a detailed point with regard to the sajda that's performed after the salam. So the first idea is we understand that sajda sahw is performed at two different time periods. Before the salam, after the salam. Before the salam is for deficiencies. After the salam is for additions. We add a little more knowledge. If you have a deficiency in the salah and you add it to the salah as well, then you perform that before the salam because of the deficiency to cover your ground on that regard. So here in this section, the question comes up, if you forgot to make the prostration of forgetfulness, that's supposed to be performed before the salam, what do you do? So here it says, whoever forgets the two prostrations for forgetfulness that come before the salam, until after he has already said Assalamu alaikum, meaning that at that point he's has completed the salam without the prostration. He was supposed to, or she was supposed to, make the prostration before the salam because there's a deficiency. So that person should perform the prostration for forgetfulness. If it was that he remembered or she remembered almost immediately, that's important. If the time they remembers is like right after the salah, right after the salah. Now, if a long time passes or the person leaves the masjid, then the sajda itself is invalidated, meaning it can no longer be the means by which to correct the salah. And in addition to that, the salah is invalidated. Now, the exception to that is if it was that the person was deficient in the sunan khafifa, meaning three of the sunans. Why is it doing that? They are not considered muakkadat, or more than that. If not, if it's less than that, then the salah is not invalid. Again, so here, if what was missed is three or more, and it was not addressed, uh, then the salah is invalid. If it's not, then there's some leeway in that regard. Now, the issue here was not mentioned is the muakkadat, right? So the muakkadat, as a matter of priority, um, we have to be aware of that. We have to be aware of that. The priority there, and we have to realize that it is going to invalidate the salah if it is the question that we uh, missed it, right? That's why I said that here some of the logic is that the sunnah looks more like the here is kind of imitating the fard salah. But remember, we said here, I mean the fard aspects of the salah. But remember that we said here that here initially this concept of that the sujud is sunnah. Well, here it doesn't look like sunnah because if it was sunnah, why would the salah be invalidated? And that's why I said there's a nuance point. The language here, you know, is 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 qualified by the example. The language that it's says the sahwa sunnah, it's a general language. It's general is but does that mean that in every case it's like that? No. And this the first example that we encounter, first example that we encounter points to that reality. The first example that we're encountering is one person that misses a number of sunan, and we should include in that sunan and muakkada as well. And a time gap comes in between them and the salah, or they leave the space, they leave the masjid. The fact that that person didn't make sajda sahu because of that deficiency and time came in between himself or herself and the salah, meaning that there's a gap of time afterwards before the person remembered or the person left the masjid. Well, the salah is invalid in this point, right? On those 3 points that sunan muakkadat, here he mentions if it's three or more sunan and there's a gap of time or the person left the masjid, left the space that that person was praying in. Any questions at this point for that? Any questions or it's clear so far? Okay, so now if a person forgets the sujud that is to be done after the salam, then that person makes that sujud even if it's after a year upon remembering. Right. But that point of the salat becoming invalid is not attached to that case. Now we enter a new topic here. We enter into a new topic. See. Thing is acting up on me. So let's leave this like this way because it's there you go. So the new topic is the person that, and we talked about this before, but what I'm trying to show you is how we talked about the topic before, but I want to pause for a moment to point out the logic here. The color coding is there to kind of see how there's a topic, how there's topics or themes that are dealt with in the text, right? So first, we're kind of defining what is Sajda Sahw, when does it take place, right? Then we come to the point that there are two types of Sajda Sahw, or we can say there's two occasions in which Sajda Sahw takes place: before the salam, after the salam. Then the topic is opened up. If Sajda Sahw is not performed under certain conditions, your salah can be considered to be invalid. And that is related to the topic of Sajda Sahw before the salam. If you forget to perform it under certain conditions, here just mentioned the three sunnah or more, right? But not much is mentioned about al-muakkadat, and I inserted that in there to emphasize its strength. If if it's if it goes unperformed and the person leaves the salah and a gap of time comes in, then the sajda sahw becomes invalidated and the salah is a consequence. If the person leaves the place of prayer here is designated as the masjid, then now the person runs into the whole issue of the salah also being invalid, right? Then the topic comes up. What about if a person, and we had this in blue. What about if the person makes a mistake in the salah such that they add on to the salah and they owed sajda sahw? They were supposed to make sajda sahw after the salam and they forgot. Well, the person prays or makes the sajda sahw whenever they remember, even if it's after a year. Even if it's after a year. Then a topic comes up, a new topic comes up. If a person is deficient in their fard, or if a person is deficient in the fada'il of the salah, do they have to make sajda sahw? Can anyone answer that question based on what we covered?
Can you repeat that one more time?
If a person is deficient in their fard, is let me put it to you this way: can the sajda sahw cover for them in the fard?
No.
If a person misses an act that is classified as a fadila or meritorious of the meritorious parts of the salah, do they have to make sajda sahw?
If they're deficient in the fodder, right? That's what you're saying?
No, there's two different issues here. It's just that I'm going by the line of al-Akhdari. If the person is deficient in the fard, you already said
No.
that making sajda sahw by itself is not sufficient to cover that deficiency. But what about if they are deficient in the fada'il of the prayer? Do they have to make sajda sahw?
I'm not sure. I'm not gonna jump out there. I'm not sure.
We mentioned that there's no, remember, we mentioned in the, remember that we mentioned in, uh,
But,
remember that we mentioned here,
wait a
remember
minute.
we
Yeah,
mentioned this
yeah.
area, there's no sajda sahu. So the fada'il, these areas, there's no sajda sahu. The areas that are marked as red.
Okay.
The areas that are marked as green, there's sajda sahu. That means it's a goat. The areas that are marked as red, there is no sajda sahu. There's no sajda sahu.
I got a quick question. All
Yeah.
right. So I see that we're having like the with the fada'il and the fard and all that. We there's no such stuff, right? But let's just say like
No, with the
I'm
fada'il, there's no sajda sahu.
there.
The
Okay.
fard, we mentioned that there's a detailed point, and
Okay.
that
Okay.
is
Okay.
that sajda sahu by itself
Doesn't cover it.
doesn't cover it. But we mentioned that I feel, and I've learned that more so. I had that understanding before, but to the credit of the class, in taking the time out to kind of like to taking the time out to prepare for this class and looking through the books and listening as well, to me is very clear. And I mentioned this, and I don't mention this to kind of disanimate anyone, and I don't mention this to tear down the madhahib, but this is one of the criticisms that's waved at the madhahib sometimes, that comes from groups like the Salafi circle and this type of stuff. But Salafis are not by themselves in that. There's other people that have said the same thing, even some other tendencies. And it's something that has to be understood, like that ideas are presented and they necessarily are not clear, or they become overly complicated and they make the situation difficult. Now, from the angle of being in the dhikr of Allah, and from the angle of being together and studying and getting the blessing of Allah tabarak wa ta'ala from that, but then it's no issue, right? But from the angle of delivering the information with clarity, meaning us being in this process and kind of working it out and spending a lot of time and this, that, okay, we come together. It's a time period we come together. We remind each other of deen. Remember Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala in the process. We remember how to better our practice. It kind of keeps us moving. All of these types of things is fine when we come together. But the reality of the knowledge also has to come about. And so when you start, the reality of the knowledge means that we have to get some sort of understanding. It just can't be that we don't have understanding. So studying fiqh, sometimes you could go through the process and it's not clear in your mind. Even if you're overseas in Medina or this, that, whatever, you're in Egypt, you're in Yemen, wherever, you can go through these educational processes and really be deficient because you just study the book and that's it. And you don't really get a grasp. So I'm saying that to say, now let me bring something, the point that's very specific. The presentation of this, I'm not too pleased with the way that it comes up in the books. And what I'm seeing is respectful people in the madhab. And it's not a criticism on the scholars or whatever, you want to say, uh people of knowledge of the past. But there's work that needs to be done to clarify this stuff if we're going to talk about using the madhab as a viable means to learn the deen. And that's why when people come up and they try to say, well, you need to learn the madhab. And I say, hold on a second. Like, you don't have experience. You're talking without educational experience. There's a process to learning the madhab so you can learn correctly. And there's confusion that comes up at times, and not everybody knows how to handle that. Versus you give somebody a simple idea of how to practice, and that's it. But when you start talking about a madhab, you start talking about that it's not just a clear idea. Sometimes with the madhab, you have multiple opinions in the madhab. So then it's about learning what is the opinion that is presented to the people. There's a lot that goes into it because it is a specialized area of knowledge. So to be very clear, the presentation of Sajda Sahw and Fard is probably one of the most confusing points for people in general, because people think that Sajda Sahw can cover the Fard. Now, the madhab so far in the books at this smaller level and what we've been covering, it has been very clear to say Sajda Sahw is not enough to cover you if you have a deficiency in the fard. But what's not mentioned is when you correct the deficiency in the fard, that says the sahw complements it. That's my beef here. That's my issue. You understand what I'm saying? The other issue is that what's left unclear, which the onus falls on the teacher, is says the sahw and the shurut of the salah. How does, working, getting this area of knowledge to be clear to the student, getting this area of knowledge to be clear as well. You know, how do we work with, says the sehu piece and the fard piece, right? That's part of going over this again and taking our time and kind of trying to work it out. You know what I'm saying? Trying to work out the understanding. And that's the whole purpose of the questioning, because it is kind of an examination of what is clear, what's not clear, what we need to continue to work on. But the book itself is not telling you that. And a good portion of the books are not going to tell you that. That's the deficiency. Even you can go deep and you can go to the more extensive books and you may not find it. And I'm telling you because from experience, from experience, you have to keep going back, keep going back, keep going back. You know, um, and that's the let me show you something. Okay. So, because I wasn't sharing a file. Okay, so this here is 17 pages of notes. Okay. It's not, not every page is to the full extent, but this is based on Sheikh Abdul Karim Qabool, or Dr. Abdul Karim Qabool. And he's not someone that is pretty much know, right? So he did about an hour and a half, no, actually, maybe about 3 hours, something close to that, uh, of short sessions just dealing with Sujud Sahu. And I took 17 pages of notes from this, and I started to kind of reorder it and use some of his system as well. Part of this first thing that we've been covering here came from that, right, along with my own additions. But when you look, he's going through, and I mean, of course, not all of this is understandable because some of it is Arabic. But I'm just showing you that, like for instance, here he just covered forgetfulness in Al-Fatiha. Four scenarios about that, and and the detail that comes in. And so then he mentions why it is that throughout the books you're going to find the scholars differ based on certain principles, on how they understand. Remember, we said that Salah consists of words and actions. So some of them, they allow for mistakes in words, but they don't allow mistakes in actions. So then when they get into the whole issue of determining where you make sajda sahwa at and where you don't, you have differences among the scholars, right? So then there's the whole issue of words that are could be considered du'a or part of the salah, and words that are not. How it is that we deal with that. The concept that I'm trying to bring to you is like this is 17 pages of trying to make sense of here. And this point is okay when you this is a point that he brought up because of the issue of the issue of sajda sahu and the salam or the taslim, and how do you deal with the other madhab. That's a whole issue in itself. And what I'm saying to you is like when we start talking about studying madhabi fiqh, the issues that we confront sometimes are everything about presentation. Because in the Maliki school itself, and I mentioned this a number of times, in the Maliki school itself, there is sometimes problems in the way that the madhab is communicated. Part of it, and this is not necessarily a completely knowledge-based position, but is an observation that has been made by people that have some love and knowledge in the madhab, that the fall of Al-Andalus did a lot of damage to the Maliki school in terms of you had you basically had a genocide, and it had massive impact and disruption, and then you had colonization and everything else that came after that, which that has had a big impact on our educational institutions. I was just listening to a 3 hour lecture by Dr. Thair Halak, and he was talking about his whole thing. He's focusing on Ibn Taymiyyah studies, but he was talking about how it is that our educational institutions are ridden with problems. And it's true. You go to study traditionally, there's no written research. They just started doing that in Al-Azhar recently. You go to the university, they don't teach, like you may not cover one complete book for the lack of terminology here, a traditional text from beginning to end. You may not even go through the whole madhab from beginning to end. You may cover parts, if that. Azhar is probably one of the better places to go to the university in that regard because you learn how to read the texts. But in the university, it's not like the masjid. The masjid, you can read a book from anywhere in a year to 5 years. But that doesn't also mean that you're always going to be tested in the same way. So it's a mess. You go to Medina, there's not a lot of emphasis put on memorization of Quran. They've gotten better on that. And they focus heavily on hadith and they downplay a lot of other sciences. You go to Al-Azhar and there's a lot of emphasis placed on al-ulum al-aqliya, intellectual sciences, and you have to search out. You can study hadith sciences, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to be at a critical level. It doesn't mean that Azhar is weak in hadith. It's just you got to find it out. But the program, you know, it's a deficiency all around. You go to some of the universities in Morocco. The only thing you're studying is Maliki fiqh. You go to you go to India, Pakistan, Hanafi fiqh. It is deen for the most part. As much of all we can talk about the four madhabs talk. At the end of the day, it's deen. If you deviate from that, you're deviating from deen. So we have to realize that it's a process that we're in, right? And we have to be patient with the process. We can't get caught up in ideological positioning. This group says this, that group says that. A lot of these groups, they're just talking and they may mean well, right? But when it comes down to the work, there's issues as far as gaining literacy. It's like going to public school in the hood and versus going to a lottery school. And you yourself, you're from Philly. If you don't go to a lottery school, you if you don't go to Central or something like that, you may be really challenged. And so is the we have those deficiencies. So you have to be patient when you study the madhab and when you study the books of the madhab because it takes a process and it takes good education to kind of work through some of the issues that are there on the level of pedagogy, meaning at the level of book selection and at the level of how you teach and so on and so forth. So these things, it takes some time to clarify them out. So the presentation of the fard and sajda sahu is a poor presentation. Other than just saying that sajda sahu doesn't cover for the fard if there's a deficiency in it, it's still a poor presentation. You see what I'm saying? And that's why I mentioned the whole issue of, notes. You know, even here, see it says, so in the conditions, this is the point here, the shurut. So the angle that's taken is if there is, if there's if the person remembers and has capacity to address the deficiencies in the conditions, right? Then it's fine. So the salah, if there's a deficiency in that area, the salah is sound based on the consideration of difference. That's a principle that has to be explained why that is. But that goes back to the dalil side of things. But at face value, when you look at this, it's not necessarily clear in the whole issue of sajda sahu and the how do you deal with deficiencies in these areas. So we're left primarily with working with the fara'id and the sunan and distinguishing between the khafifa and the muakkadat. And we boil down the muakkadat to be eight, right? Everything else after that is just scenarios. What happens in this case, what happens in that case. But the point being is that sajda sahu requires a person to know what are the fara'id, what are the sunan. We mentioned the muakkadat. The other, if you know what the fara'id are and what the muakkadat are, then if you miss three or more of the lighter sunan, three plus, then that's when you make sajda sahu. That's the easy way out of that, as far as having an understanding of what it is that necessitates sajda sahu, or put it a different way, what are the areas that sajda sahu covers? When do I make it? Right. That's the basic framework. That's the basic framework in place. In the Hanafi school, and the way we see it, the sajda sahu is wajib. And we mentioned that, you know, we say that it's sunnah, but it's not necessarily the case that we follow that all the way through. Because if you miss sajda sahu in the case of a deficiency, stay with me with the example, meaning that if you were obligated to make sajda sahu for a deficiency before the salam, if you don't do it under certain circumstances, your salah is invalid. So, although we say that it's sunnah in a detailed point, we're also saying that it's wajib. So, those things are not a contradiction. We just have to understand the way that the fiqh operates. We have to understand that the way the fiqh operates, and there's some detail to that, and that takes patience. That's where, within the idea of the Salafi da'wah, there was no patience with the madhab, because immediately they start asking for dalil. And that came in part from the da'wah of people like Sheikh Mukbil, rahmatullahi alayhi. But Sheikh Mukbil was talking to students of knowledge. And translators started to translate Sheikh Mukbil's stuff. And they were translating stuff that he was saying in Damaj, in Dar al Hadith, in Damaj. And they were bringing that into the US and to England as well, and other places. But other places don't concern me so much. So they're bringing that into an environment where people are not even studying. They're bringing that into an environment where people are not teaching. And so it created a lot of confusion, because then when you study these books in madhabi fiqh, you're not encountering evidence always. You're encountering the ruling. They're trying to get you to think about how to conceptualize the action. And then at a higher level, you deal with the evidences. So we have a clash of methodologies, and nobody wants to correct it, because everybody wants to say it's either this way or that way. It's not. That's not the case at all, right? The Salafi Da'wah was a revival movement, and the revival effort was, let us have an understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah, and let us be aware of those practices which are problematic. Let us be aware of practices which are based on weak textual evidences. That type of thinking was there. That is a revival effort, just like Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi had a revival effort. Now, it's the job of the student to realize you need to shut your mouth on an occasion in which you don't know what you're talking about, even if it seems like you know what you're talking about. So there's no necessity to argue because if you understand the methodology, you don't have to agree with it, but they're operating from XYZ. And the problem with the Salafi da'wah is that, for instance, when it came to issues of fiqh and all of that, they were not really teaching a lot of that stuff. They were just teaching basic books and they were not teaching much depth. So it created confusion. It has gotten a lot better, but it created confusion. The same thing with those that were teaching madhabi fiqh because they were around. They didn't know how to handle those questions. I remember when I was in Michigan, some of the scholars didn't know how to handle the questions. They were following Hanafi fiqh and they felt threatened. And it just saying, instead of just saying, look, they have a different angle on the way they approach the hadith, they have a different angle in the way they approach the fiqh. They're just trying to invalidate what it is that's being said and not even being able to explain themselves 100% why it is that they practice certain things. Right. So, those things come up. So, for instance, in the Hanafi school, the idea is that the Sajda Sahw is wajib, and all of it is. And I had said the wrong thing earlier, so I want to correct. All of it is after the salam. And in the Shafi school, all of it is before the salam. I had mixed the positions up. The reason why that's mentioned, Abdul Karim mentions that, Sheikh Abdul Karim, he mentions it. And the reason why he mentions it is because the Musalli and the Imam encounters other madhab. So they have different ways of doing these things. So you have to have some understanding of what's going on, right? At the end of the day, you know, if you're following an imam and they do something different, you go with the flow as much as you can. There's some details to that, but for the sake of not creating confusion, you have to uh, kind of create that environment where there's some tolerance, right? So let's go back to
So
our
like
Walaikum salam.
I just want to say that makes a lot of sense for me as I'm navigating different communities, different people, different races, different cultures, different understandings of the deen. I still stick to one madhahib, or I'm trying to learn one madhahib, but it's there's always a conflict when I run into people. Certain things are black and white and certain things are not. And that's where this helps me in my own personal journey as far as even staying in the deen, because it can become so problematic when it's like, well, dang, I can't do anything right or everything I do is wrong. It could be a crisis in faith. So I appreciate, us recognizing different madahibs and also understanding at the same time that we do need to try to stick to one. But in our interactions with one another, it's important to understand where other people are coming from, where they're getting their information from, um, so that it causes less dissension. I don't think that's cherry picking to understand that
Well,
there may be. Mhm.
even with the issue of cherry picking, like when Sheikh Abdul Karim Kabul, when he finished this section of Sajda Sahw, and he talked about some of the imams caving into the Hanbalis. He was talking about that in Morocco. That he was like he felt as though some people were caving into the Hanbali school, right? And so the thing that came up was that in my mind was he was just like, oh, just he was like just don't he was like, don't play games, right? Don't be like some people play games and this and that. And I felt as though it's provocative, right? Because the reality of this situation is that people are not always necessarily playing games. Sometimes people are trying to make sense of how to practice. And the other issue is that you can keep saying, well, you're not a mujtahid, this, that. You can keep saying that all you want, but we contradict ourselves because in studying traditional usul al-fiqh, and I hate to use the word traditional, but since it's forced upon us because of the ideological approaches that we take, instead of just saying um usul al-fiqh, then we have to say traditional or Salafi or this, that, because of how low level, I'll be honest, and I'm being kind of harsh with my words here, of how low level a lot of our teachers are coming from. You know what I'm saying? And you realize that when you go to higher level circles of knowledge, in higher level circles of knowledge, you may have that bias that comes in, but there's an acknowledgement at least of where knowledge is at, and you can tell that there's a bias there. I mean, we knew that in dealing with the scholars on a regular basis. We saw that when there was a bias there. But the point being is that we tell people in the study of traditional usul al-fiqh, we tell people that al-ijtihad la yanqud al-ijtihad. One ijtihad can't invalidate another ijtihad. And so then if we apply that to the madhab, we say, you hear all this talk, and I mentioned this before. Well, the four madhabs, whichever you follow is the right way, and if you follow outside of the four madhabs is the deviation. Now, when you start getting into these details, especially in the salah together, or just like when you have a diversity of people, then all of a sudden you start seeing a whole different approach come about. And so then the question becomes more of like, what could you teach? How are you going to teach in a way where congregations can function? Because there's a difference between individual practice and collective practice. So when you're doing Eid, when you're doing Salatul Jum'ah, when you're doing Salatul Janaza, there's when you're doing Salatul Jama'ah, when you're collecting zakah for the community, somewhere along the line, you're going to have to take some positions. And so either you're going to be as inclusive as possible, or you're just going to be exclusive, right? And alienate the people that are in the masjid. And so that's the dilemma that we encounter, that we don't realize that there's another level of fiqh. And at one point in time, these issues were not issues because the imam, meaning in this case, the political leader of the Muslim, would impose what the rule was. So al imam yarfa al khilaf. So it's just like the concept of state government and local government and federal government, and who comes, and we have that conflict now in the country, that we have a battle between the different layers of government, and it's getting pretty intense and problematic. We did not have that problem before, right? We didn't have mayors stepping in and kind of like trying to challenge where federal law is, because federal law is invading the jurisdiction of the state, and cities didn't have that in the same way, right? So it's the same thing when it comes to the fiqh, same concept,
Absolutely. I was gonna
so
say, like, if you're not listening to, and I'm sorry for interrupting, but if you're not listening, if you're not with the people, understanding their personal struggles and what they're faced with when it comes to trying to apply the principles of the deen, then it could cause more harm. Like inheritance, and the fact that it's supposed to be split. I mean, there's so many instances where people are not considering or willing to listen to a person's personal circumstances to give them guidance on how to actually apply fiqh, because there's things that are there inheritance, for example, not taking into consideration, like, okay, this person gets this much, but let's say this person is on drugs. So you're basically giving them money and they're going to hurt themselves. Or a situation where a man doesn't know how to pray and his daughter is trying to teach him how to offer salah. Like, these are areas where I've received feedback and admonition, basically like taking that context and nullifying it, as opposed to say, okay, how does the dean support and, support this evidence? It can't, you can have a code of ethics, but then you also have to look at the personal individual to see how it applies, if it applies, where's the maxims.
Well, that's the issue that the rest of you still there, Hanif too.
Yeah, I wanted to say something, but I didn't want to interrupt, so I'm just letting y'all
I'm here. I'm listening.
Yeah, the whole issue of the mufti, right, and the body of scholarship. That's where the dilemma comes in at. That even in the U.S., when you look at some of our top fiqh councils, they're just fatwa banks. They're not really addressing situations on the ground. So we have a deficiency where, when you start talking about something like inheritance, that's so far from where most people are at. I think, like for instance, in the UK, they're a little more advanced with that. They even got to the level of creating apps to determine inheritance within the Hanafi school. But a lot of these other issues are not even brought up. Like it's just algorithmic. Whatever said in the fifth book, we just plug in uh, the units, meaning the people that exist or that are alive, and then we churn out some sort of formulaic position. So it's a reality. You know what I'm saying? It's a reality of that. What's the reality? Is the reality that we lack leadership, and we're trying to build leadership, and we're deficient people at the same time. And it's not going to clarify itself, or the situation is not going to be clear until we do talib ilm very seriously. And it's like Dr. Thaid Halak was mentioning about his constituency, is that and in the Azhar is a little different as well, because the Mufti in Al Azhar and Dar al Ifta, the program included the study of psychology, sociology. You have to know other sciences that are dealing with society and culture and this, that. You got to know that type of stuff. Just studying a fiqh text is not going to make you a mufti. And that's what we have done. You know what I'm saying? We've reduced the idea of being a mufti to that. The other issue is that there's just situations which an individual alone can't cover it. You have to have a team of scholars. And that stuff was very clarified by a number of scholars in the past, recent past, but it's not followed. So you have some fiqh councils that they have attempted to address these issues, but some of the stuff that you're talking about on the local level, in reality, the masjid has no. When you have a masjid that's controlled by professionals who don't care about Islamic scholarship and they think that they're superior, which is what's going on, you're never going to address the community issues totally, because they're just going to address who's the donor base. So that's why, even just like I said, like when it comes to the issue of being patient with the study of the madhab and learning how to work through the issues that we encounter in madhab based fiqh, there are issues. Those that try to paint it like there's no issues, they're delusional. they're delusional in that thinking, right? Because no solid scholars are saying that there's no issues in the way that the madhab type fiqh is presented. That's why they start writing new books. That's why they take other approaches in presenting the information. Even they started introducing the whole idea of bringing in visuals. There's a whole set of new dynamics. So the Muslim world on some of these issues is way more advanced than where we are. But we have to, just like we have to be patient in that process, because we're trying to benefit from the knowledge of the scholars of the past, and on some things we can directly benefit, and other things we need to address them by referring to the scholars of the current age, right? The same goes to the community issue. The community where is at is in a process of growth. And so there's a lot of challenges that are there that they're similar to what is going on when it comes to the education and the deen. So you just have to learn how to stay out of the way as much as possible, because it can affect somebody's iman. It can affect somebody's psychological well-being because of the way that they encounter the community, the way they're treated by the community, but also because of the way that knowledge is taught. So a lot of what we find like online is like I was thinking about this recently, because it's a complete, it's like it's like being in a parallel dimension. When I look at what's going on in the Arabic speaking world, in terms of social media, in terms of things like YouTube, in terms of things like educational projects, they're way more advanced. So each sheikh is going to have, if he's a sheikh that really is serious about his work, he's going to have his students and he's going to have his classes, and you're going to look up his work, and you're going to see that he has hundreds of classes that he has taught, and that stuff is accessible online. When you look at what's going on over here, you could barely find a class that is even for free. And when you look at what's being produced, somebody may be a rock star, so to speak, on Instagram, on YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, but they don't have any. There's no, aside from some of them are in a better position than others, may have a couple books here and there, but there's really no work. It's all inspirational talk, right? So it's not like like you look some of these people talking about Aqidah. How many classes have they taught in Aqidah? Level one, level two, level three. You don't see it. You understand what I'm saying? You don't see it. And then it's like when it is taught, there's so much confusion that's in it, you can't even establish a real foundation because it's all oppositional. It's all about how my group is right and the other group is wrong. And then the other side is like everything is all philosophical, or everything is just like all shut your mind down, right? So each community is contributing to the problem because they're trying to figure out themselves how to establish themselves. And I'm talking about each group is contributing to the problem, whether it's ethnic group or whether it is methodological group or dawa group. There's no strategy. There was no, like the Sahaba, when they went, they had a strategy, right? When the Sahaba went into Iraq, when they went into Syria, when they went into Egypt, there was a strategy. There were people that were appointed to teach. There were people that were appointed for administration. There was a strategy. The masajid don't have a strategy. You know what I'm saying? The institutions don't have a strategy as well. I'm talking about as far as building the community. They're very much concerned with keeping a following and the donor base and this and that. That's where things are at. And the institutions of learning, a lot of them are concerned with, uh, they're concerned with preservation of identity. not necessarily addressing issues. And so we're in a very weird place because that's kind of where things are at. Like we're in a phase where we're still growing. And along with that comes a lot of frustration, right? And I don't foresee this getting any better anytime soon because you have now serious immigration challenges. And we may end up seeing is a possibility. Who knows where this goes? Honestly, I don't want to get into that type of conversation, but who knows where this goes? Because people are saying that the country is unstable, is leading is going towards instability, rather we should say. And so you have right now you have the Somali community targeted. So who else gets stripped of their status? And so then you're gonna have a portion of people, you know, that is questionable whether they're even going to be around or what their role will be. You have the indigenous Muslims at this point consisting of those who have been born here and came into Islam and those who came from Muslim families and they were born here. And that group is caught up with no real vision as well. So it seems dark, but what I'm saying is like the only way out of that is by having a clear path that you're treading. So that's the role of teaching these types of concepts that no, we have to have a certain degree of tolerance. No, we have to, it's not just book knowledge. You have to understand how to deal with the people. No, it's not just your situation, it's also thinking about the collective. No, it's not just, coming together, you have to institutionalize. No, it's not just about the present, it's also about the future. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a lot of things that go into community building, and part of it is if we don't get our knowledge of the deen correct as well, it's not going to go anywhere, right? And one of the things is we have to know how where this type of knowledge fits. It's not equivalent to Quran and Sunnah, and that's a lesson that I was hoping that we would at least learn from that Salafi type of environment, right? Because it's a right lesson, but also it's not trash that you just throw to the side. You know what I'm saying? The knowledge that we inherit from the scholars, I'm not going to sit here and say sacred knowledge and all this type of conversation, but it's insight. It's insight. It communicates wisdom, and it communicates wisdom by communicating experience, and it just needs to be clarified and facilitated for the people. Right? It has its place. Right? It has its place, but that doesn't stop me from bringing up the challenges that come along with specifically teaching Maliki fiqh. Maliki fiqh has a certain set of challenges which other madhahib don't have. Of these challenges is that in our little books, and I mentioned it before, Ibn Khaldun mentioned it as well. You know what I'm saying? You can encounter certain concepts and ideas that still need clarity, right? And people, the reason why it's tolerated is because overseas, education doesn't operate in the same way. People study this stuff when they're younger, when they're smaller, and they continue and they just move on because it's part of the culture. So when they get older, they study bigger books, or when they finish the smaller books, they go to bigger books and they continue like that. So they're in an environment of constant knowledge. They're not in a one-off type of thing. They continue with this type of stuff and they work through it, and they have their scholars. It's a whole different cultural reality. You know what I'm saying? Where we're in the process of trying to create that. Like so those are things, I just keep emphasizing that. But again, in in preparing for this class, and I was talking to my teacher about this recently as well, and he was saying, keep everything as clear as possible, right? And he was like, the other stuff you keep it for for yourself, but I want you to understand that, that there are some challenges. And in preparing for this class, you can see it. You know what I'm saying? You look through it just reaffirmed my own bias that there's a lot of work that's necessary still in order to teach the madhab. And I've been looking at it from a lot of different angles, whether it was to just rely on Ibn Ashar or whether to rely on Qadi Iyad's book, and I tried to connect with this tradition of the West African tradition because for me it's something more emotional and spiritual as well. Um, but there are challenges. You know what I'm saying? There are challenges that come along with that. What was it that you wanted to say, Hanif? Hanif, are you still with us? Rest, are you with us too or no?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, so here we come back to the issue of if a person is deficient in the fard, and we mentioned that the way that is clarified or the way that is presented is not as clear as we would like it to be, because automatically when we look here, is saying that let me put it this way. Here is just saying that the person that is deficient or is failing to establish that which is obligatory in the salah, that such the sahu is not sufficient to deal with that deficiency. We mentioned that we had you know, a long embellishment of the problem with the way that's presented, because here it says the prostration of forgetfulness the prostration of forgetfulness uh, cannot compensate for it. For what? For the obligatory part of the prayer. For the obligatory part of the prayer. Then nothing else is mentioned of that. Okay. And so what? We know that the sajda sahu is by itself is not sufficient. But does that mean that there's no relationship between sajda sahu and the action of attempting to make up the obligatory part? Or let me put it to you this way: does that mean just because it stays here that says the sahu, the prostration of forgetfulness or unmindfulness, it says here, cannot compensate for deficiency in an obligatory act? Does that mean that says the sahu has no relationship to correcting the salah in this situation? Right? And we raised that as a question, and we said no, it does not mean that. So what's left then is to ask the question, okay, so what is the relationship between sajda sahu and correcting your salah when you have a deficiency in an obligation? So what you're left with is performing the obligatory part, and there's details to that, right? But this is in the general sense, performing the obligatory part and making sajda sahu along with it. And we mentioned that before, but the presentation of it, uh, the way that this concept is presented here is not totally clear. And we're not going to say that it's a deficiency on the part of the scholar, this, that, whatever. No, it's just not clear. You understand what I'm saying? So a person reading this by themselves which has been the case of how madhab-based fiqh has been taught, which is a contradiction with the idea of traditional studies, because the traditional study focus is building a relationship between student and teacher. That's the highlight. That's the distinguishing mark, that you're not do it yourselfer. But if you read this by itself, just like if you were to read a hadith by itself, right? Same criticism that's waged at the Salafis. How can you read Quran and the Sunnah without having any understanding of the scholar? Well, if you read the books of the scholars too by yourself, then you can also come away with the wrong understanding. The other thing is that the knowledge is a process, right? Knowledge is a process. So we learn with the idea that we're going to build on the foundation of what that we're establishing. So that should be clear. Sajda Sahw by itself can't compensate for deficiency in the fara'id, but that does not mean that Sajda Sahw has no relationship to that issue. Sajda Sahw complements the performance of the obligation or the obligatory part of the prayer when that obligatory action is done to ensure that the salah is being corrected because there was a deficit in the action. And we mentioned again, if a person is deficient in the falaid, there's no such sahw. Then now a new topic is brought up, but is a subtopic. If a person misses two or more sunan, then that person makes sajda sahw. And the translation here is not good because the problem is that the wording in Arabic is given a certain it's more kind of like a aphoristic. It's more kind of like just giving you a rule. And it doesn't mean that it is the exception. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have exceptions, but it's introducing to you an idea. And the main idea that is introducing to you is that sajda sahw in relation to the sunnah, when there's a deficiency in the sunnah, and the sunnah that is classified as khafifa, right? That sajda sahw only kicks in, and here it kicks in before the salam because there's a deficiency. Sajda sahw only kicks in if you miss two or more sunnah. Now, what's missing there is what? A conversation about sunan al-muakkada. Because sunan al-muakkada, if you miss one, then sajda sahw kicks in. And that's why we say we have to be patient, because there's the text itself is only a starting point for building our knowledge. It's not the completion point, meaning we study this text and our knowledge is complete. No, the text is a bridge, is a springboard so that we build an understanding of how to practice in this case. Because there are certain things expressed in a way that is more pedagogical than it is accurate. Meaning, certain things are expressed in a certain way just to teach you a point. But that doesn't mean that the whole of the teaching, right, the way that it's the way that it's communicated is going to give you an accurate big picture of everything that's going on. No, because here it says that the prostration of mindfulness that comes before the salam is not performed except if you miss two sunans or more. So then that leaves, okay, is that the only time that you perform Sajda Sahw before the salam? Well, we learned that that's not the case. If you if you have a deficiency in the salah and you add it onto the salah, then you make Sajda Sahw before the salam. So the statement here doesn't cover that, right? The statement here only covers a point that that is to be made about the sunan that are not muakkidat. That's it. Now we have to embellish the knowledge, and he moved forward, and he says, if you miss one sunnah, there's no sujood for it. Now here he begins to change the discourse without clarifying 100% in detail. Now the discourse is changing. Why? Because it's going from a discussion on a sunnatul khafifa or the lighter sunnah to a discussion on the sunnah al-muakkadat without talking about it clearly, without saying it. So here it would be nice if there was a chapter heading. And here as well, another chapter heading at the top here. Can you see the arrow or no? Can someone verify for me if they see the arrow?
Yeah, you can see the arrow. It's jumping
Okay,
around.
so in this
Yeah.
section here, this is one section, and it's dealing with the lighter sunan. Here in this yellow section is dealing with sunan al-muakkidat, right? So how do we know that? Because when we go to other research, we realize that part of the muakkidat, it is silence when reciting the Quran, or vocalization when reciting the Quran, right? So we know that those are from the muakkidat, right? So the thing about it too, our mindset, the way that we study in this country, knowledge is classified for us, categorized for us. So we have that framework in our minds. This is not how this is done. Like the categorization and the classification, so on and so forth, is something that we do in our minds in the traditional in the study of tradition, which I had to learn that. I had to learn how to change the way that I was reading and studying. Um, when I started to study the tradition. So here in the Sunan, like we covered last time, they break up into the muakkadat, and they break up into the khifaf or the khafif or that sunnah which is khafifa. And so there's 8 muakkadat. We covered that before. Here goes the one that we just looked at in Akhdari. Right. So what happens here is that this is clarifying what falls under the category of sunan and how the sunan breaks up into 2 categories. Right. So, in other words, graphing it out, charting it out, mapping it out. This is even though this exists in Islamic scholarship, it's been done. It even goes back all the way to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the Prophet, as an educator, Sheikh Abu Ghudda, the Muhaddith, rahmatullahi alayhi, shows that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam he he records the hadith that shows how the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam drew in the ground. So these are examples of how the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam used visual aids in education. He did other things like repeat something 3 times. He used his hands. There's things that he did in gesture and in action and in speech that was complementary to his example of him modeling it himself. So there's forms of how he educated. So this concept is popular. This idea is popular in the way we do education in the West, but it doesn't mean that it's alien either. Uh, so that's something that we look at. So here he says that the leaving out of one of these 2 sunan that are from the muakkadat necessitates to make sajda sahw before the salam. Right. As for one sunnah action by itself, that's talking about the sunnah that's khafifa. There's no sujud required, except in the case, here he's mentioning the quality of silence when reciting, if that's left out, or if the vocalizing is left out.